presentation. Really excited to have Grace Couture with us today. She's a physical therapist and specializing in neuro rehabilitation. And as I mentioned earlier, we have had an ongoing conversation about recovery after stroke. When is the best time to recover? What happens 6 years after stroke? Long-term rehab? How does that impact recovery and outcomes? So Grace is going to cover everything, or most of the things, as much as she can in today's presentation. And as I said, it's going to be an ongoing conversation. So welcome, Grace.
Thanks, guys, for having me. Like Shilpa said, my name is Grace, and this presentation came out of a conversation that I think has come up during several different meetings. I'm hoping just to share a little bit about my experiences in the clinic and then what we do know from the literature about recovery after stroke. So we're going to talk about a little background on stroke. We'll sort of assess what you guys do and don't know, and we can move through some of that pretty quickly if we need to. Talk a little bit about what recovery looks like, and then how do we stay engaged? How do you guys stay engaged with your recovery after that official rehab process? My goal for this time is to keep you guys engaged. There's lots of interactive talking questions, so please participate, share your experiences. I think that will add a lot to this discussion. And if you have questions at any time, you can put it in the chat box or just raise your hand or start talking and we can pause and answer those for you guys. So who am I? Outside of being a PT, I grew up in Michigan and I did my schooling for physical therapy at Ohio State University. I'm now at Emory University. I'm doing a one-year specialty program where I'm learning all about different problems with the brain and how we can address them with physical exercise. And one of those conditions I work with very frequently is stroke. When I'm not in the clinic, I like to ride bikes and I like to climb rocks. And I'm really into birds. There's some great bird watching around here. So that's been fun. I've had a little more time to do that during COVID and seen some woodpeckers outside my window, which is fun. So it's hard with the computer, but show of hands, how many of you guys are pretty familiar with what type of stroke you had? Just sort of, you feel pretty comfortable talking about sort of what happened and what that means. So we'll maybe move through this a little bit quicker. So a stroke is a brain injury. I don't know who said that before. Dana? It is, like Shilpa talked about, it's acquired. It isn't from falling and hitting your head, but something happens and the brain tissue is damaged. And there's a couple different ways that this can happen. You can have either an ischemic stroke, which is on the left, where your brain lacks blood flow because of a clot, or you can have a hemorrhagic stroke, where a blood vessel bursts and the bleeding goes all in the brain. And these both have different risk factors that play into them. And that's something I want to talk a little bit about. So show of hands, who knows they had an ischemic stroke? In the area of the brainstem. Does that sound right? Brain also reorganizes. So if an area, it lost its job, right? It's damaged. Another area picks up the slack. It reorganizes. It says, hey, area A is not doing what it needs to. I can take that job on along with my current job, which is really cool. We also have this concept of silent connections. So in your brain right now, you have lots of connections that you're not using. They're redundant. They're just extra. But if you have brain damage from any number of things, your brain figures it out. It says, hey, I already have this other pathway. And then it takes this opportunity to turn it on. And so this once silent pathway is now turned on to do the job of the damaged area. You can also grow new connections, which is pretty cool. And then way over the point of this talk, but there's all these really interesting changes at the cellular level. So the smallest parts that adapt to help your brain recover. So all of this together is occurring over different time periods. Each of these sort of has a time when it ramps up and does the most, and then it sort of slows down. So if you look at recovery as a trajectory, there's always something sort of popping up, doing its thing, and then going down with the goal of helping you get back to that level of function that you had before. How many of you guys have heard the term neuroplasticity? Show those hands. Anybody? Yeah. All right. So this is especially in the world of neuro PT, which is where I spend most of my day, a really important word for us. So neuroplasticity is a change in the structure and function of the adult central nervous system. So the brain is part of the central nervous system. And it's in response to a variety of different stimulus, both from your own brain and your own body, and things we do from the outside, like physical therapy or exercise. And neuroplasticity is what allows learning and also recovery. And it occurs in everyone. So, not only people who have had some sort of pathology to their brain tissue, but anybody in the world. So, say you wanted to learn the piano, right? I sat down and I was like, I'm going to take up piano and I want to be a concert pianist by the end of this year. So I buy a really nice piano, I hire a piano teacher, and I practice every day, 5 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. I'm doing a lot of practice, it's intense practice, and it's really focused on the piano. My brain is going to start to go, wow, I need more space for those hands. She is asking me to do a lot of really intricate things with her hands. And so the area in my brain that represents my hand function starts to grow. And that's neuroplasticity. And it occurs with all types of learning, not just relearning how to do things after a stroke. But we take all these concepts and we apply them to how we help people recover after many different types of injury. So one of my favorite articles, and if you guys are interested in reading articles about things, I have it at the bottom. It's pretty easy to find, and I think it's well written and it's a good understanding article for these concepts of neuroplasticity. So how do we make these changes that we're encouraging the brain to make through recovery? How do we make them last? And how do we make them come as most efficiently as we can? So these authors, by looking at this huge body of research, suggest 10 ways. So the first one is use it or lose it. If you have a skill and you don't use it, what happens? You lose it. It goes away. If I don't use my bicep and I just tie my arm to the side of my body, my muscles are like, hey, there's no point for me to be here. Don't bother feeding me. They just get smaller, right? So if you had stopped working out for a while, you noticed your pants fit a little bit differently. They're not quite as tight in the back end. If you don't use it, you lose it. I want to be doing exercise that's intense and specific, and shooting for at least 30 minutes as a minimum. You got to use it to improve it. So if you're not practicing, it's not going to get better. So that function of doing the task over and over is what's going to help improve it. And these next couple are my favorite and the most important. A specific exercise is like, what was one of your big goals when you were in rehab, or even one of your big goals now? And so what makes more sense, for me to have you practice walking, or for me to have you practice sitting in your chair and strengthening your legs because you need strong legs to walk? What do you think might have a better outcome? Practicing walking a whole bunch or just sitting down and strengthening your legs? It's specific. You have to practice what you want to get better at. So if you're playing basketball and you want to get better at, I don't know, what is a 3-point, when you stand like the 3-point line and you throw the basketball, like that seems really far away from me. And so the best way to get better at that is probably not to do layups all day. It's probably to walk all the way back to the free throw line and stand there and just practice taking shots over and over again. So that's the point of this number 3 is if you want to get better at something, you have to practice that specifically. And yes, there's a point for strengthening and there's a point for working on these smaller skills that play into walking. But at some point, you just got to get those steps in because that's really what's going to make the difference. And playing into that too, you have to do it a whole bunch. Think about how much time just you guys spend in therapy in a week. Maybe 45 minutes to an hour. Does that sound right? If you go twice a week, maybe 2 hours. And compared to that, you're living life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So maybe we do 20 sit to stands in a therapy session, and we really make sure you're doing them right. But then at home, you're doing so many more. So in order for our brain to learn, we have to do something thousands and thousands of times for that motor pattern, for our brain to learn what we want. So repetition is really important. Thinking about how the skills you're working on occur frequently throughout your day and take advantage of all those. And once you're medically clear to keep working and your blood pressure is stable and you are returning to your health, you did the right thing, right? You took control and you took power of your health and your exercise, and you sought out people who are giving you intensity, which is really important for making these changes last. And I think in the therapy world, it's something we're really starting to push, but it's hard at times. It's hard to make intense workouts in 45 minutes. And therapy's not enough. So the fact that you sought out some sort of exercise outside, that's my goal for all of my patients. If my patients don't feel empowered to take their exercise into their own hands and go home and do their workouts and progress them and find a trainer and go to a gym, then I didn't do my job right either. Working at an intensity that's challenging makes a huge difference. And we're going to come back to this later in the PowerPoint too, because that's how important it is. Also, neuroplasticity is best when you start early. So the sooner you start after your injury, the better. But that doesn't mean that starting a little later, you can't make improvements. Also, picking tasks that are important to you and that are motivational. The more you enjoy what you're doing, the more intense you work, the more reps you do, the more specific your practice is. Also, for this group, being younger is something we know that improves your ability for your brain to make lasting changes. That doesn't mean that older individuals can't do this. It just takes a little more time and a little more effort. And then it's also important that we prime your system. We want to put you in the best environment for your brain to soak all this information in. And one of the techniques we know that work with that is aerobic exercise. So often I'll have patients start out the session on a bike or on a treadmill or walking in the hall or around the building, because that gets your blood flowing. It gets your brain primed for all this learning that I'm going to throw at it in the next 45 to 60 minutes. And then lastly, I'm hearing this from a lot of you, you're doing it well, you got to fight the roadblocks. There's so many things that come in that impede our ability to learn. Distractions, some things like chemically in the brain, and our own personal motivation too makes a huge difference. And like you guys being here and being invested in this learning and your health and recovery, that's fighting a roadblock. So I love seeing you here, and I think that's making a positive impact on your recovery. So how are you guys driving neuroplasticity? Where do you see these concepts integrated into your rehab or your home exercise program or a class you go to at the Y? Or are these concepts new to you? Have you never heard these before? I'd be interested in that too. A couple patients right now on return to running after stroke. And it's hard, right? Because there's a lot of things that sort of build into running. Needing to be able to hop on one leg and have good balance and have the endurance. So if that's a progression you're struggling with, I'd encourage you to reach out to your PT, and I'm sure they can help you with that. But yeah, like at some point you walk really fast, and when you get to the point where you're power walking and you're comfortable, at some point you start taking those faster steps. And if you're comfortable sort of standing there and hopping on one leg and have that balance, then yeah, running is the next step. So what does time look like? What does that recovery look like after stroke? So big picture, there's 3 phases that we talk about and that a lot of the literature looks at specifically. So acute phase is about that first week or so. And then you progress into the subacute phase, which is that first 1 week to 6 months. And then after 6 months, it's considered a chronic condition. So within those phases, like I mentioned before, we have that spontaneous recovery. If you sat there and did absolutely nothing, your brain would heal. It would go through the paces and give you as much function back as it could through that natural healing. So that is occurring most in that first 1 to 3 months. And then we also have therapeutic induced recovery. So you're working with your therapist, you're moving, you're working with your family, you're staying motivated. That can go from the first 24 hours after stroke to we honestly have no idea. It can go forever. You can always keep training your brain. You can always get stronger. You can always keep moving better. And so a lot of the literature doesn't look at chronic stroke 20 years post. That's just not something that I can give you an answer from the science. But as clinicians, we can speak about what we see in the clinic, which I think has so much value as well. So considering that, there's this golden window, right? So we know that that spontaneous recovery is happening in the first 1 to 3 months. So if we're taking that spontaneous recovery and we're pushing it with our movement and our therapies, we can elevate all that and we can make it occur faster and more efficiently and make sure you're getting to that maximum point you can get. So earlier is better. And on the right here, where'd my cursor go? This is what this graph shows. So the people on this part had a short time between their injury and starting rehab. And these people had a long time between their injury and starting rehab. And you can see that the people with the shorter time had more improvement than the people with the long time to starting. But these people still made improvements. So there's room for that growth. And this graph is to just show you sort of that golden window. So down here you have 0 months and 3 months. And the steeper the bar goes up, the quicker that recovery is happening. So the bars that are steepest are occurring between 0 and 1, and then 1 and 3. And then here between 3 and 6, right, the bars are still going up. They're just not going up quite as quickly. So as we're getting to that 6-month mark, you can still make improvements. It's just going to be slower. And that's what I think the big takeaway is here. Recovery doesn't end at 6 months. Recovery doesn't end when you leave rehab. It's going to get harder the longer you go and the more function you gain towards the top of your max, but it's still there. All right. So jumping back in, I think some of the big takeaways from all this and things to remember when you're reading the research and talking to your healthcare professionals is the first thing, I think we said this a couple times, and you guys have experienced this personally, is that all strokes are different. Like Shilpa said, the research is an average of all the different people, but you guys are all individuals too, and you have your individual journeys, and what we read there doesn't let us say specifically what your case is going to be. And considering that too, recovery is highly multifactorial. There's so many things. Remember, we talked about that list at the beginning about some of the scientific aspects of your recovery in your brain, but that list is so long, and it's things we don't even understand yet, things we haven't discovered in the brain. And it's challenging to translate what we see in the clinic into a good reproducible long-term study. And so like Shilpa was saying, like the process to get a grant and to run one of these studies is a long process. And so hopefully, as these have become in questions and we've been learning more about recovery, that we'll start to see some more of these studies. But looking at what we see in the clinic is very promising. And the patients that we see that come in that are 10, 15 years post, there's a lot of things we can still work on. Very passionate about intensity, dosage, and duration. They all matter. And if you're not doing them at an appropriate level, your change is going to be hard to see. So thinking about all that when you're designing a program or working with somebody to design a program for you. And then finally, the body is very good at compensating. Our brains are smart. How many of you after stroke remember when, for those who had motor deficits in maybe an arm or a leg, where you use the other side of your body, you probably can't see my arm, the other side of your body to help move your weaker side. Did anybody have that experience? A lot of times for those who do start to get that strength back is that you've developed a compensation. Your brain has figured out a really easy way to move your arm or your leg. But at some point that strength starts to come back and you might not always notice it. So what I see a lot happen is I say, hey, why don't you get your legs off, feet off the feet rest and put your feet on the floor? And the first thing a lot of people do is use their arm to try and move their leg. And so I'll say, hey, you know, let's take a break. And I want you to try to move your leg without using your arm. And it just pops right up and goes on over. And that's because your brain has compensated. It's found a quicker way to avoid the muscle that's not quite as strong as it used to be. But we can work on those compensations. And it's important to work on those compensations early so you can maximize that recovery. So all the neuroplasticity doesn't just occur in the damaged area, but it can occur in the normal areas as well that have just developed these abnormal pathways. So what do we do about all this? You guys have quite a range of time that you're out from stroke. What does that look like for you now? No matter what stage you're in, whether you've had a stroke or not, just part of living a healthy lifestyle is finding a way to integrate this exercise into your everyday. And that's going to look different for everybody. So I've listed a couple things here. So maybe you're seeing a PT still. Maybe you have felt like you've plateaued, but you have this new goal. Somebody in your family is getting married and you want to wear high heels to the wedding. And that's important to you. Or you've decided you're going to try and run a 5K and you want some help progressing from walking to running. So you've called your PT and you've set up a new set of therapy sessions. But outside of that, treating your PT more like your dentist, I think, is important, especially when you're dealing with a condition that affects your mobility. And that's going to continue to change as you continue to age and your lifestyle changes. So having somebody who's there that you can ask questions to and you can check in with every 6 to 12 months, that you're doing some measures, you're making sure your gait speed's still normal, and you can catch problems early. And you can target strength that's decreasing, and you can target the hip that's tight, that's keeping you from walking the speed you like. Another way you might be able to continue intense rehab is with a home exercise program. So a lot of you, it sounds like you've had relationships with PTs in the past, and maybe they've sent you home with some exercises. So really communicating with your therapist during that initial session and getting a home exercise program that you can stick to and that you really enjoy, that's intense and it hits things that help you maintain your goals. And then I think where a lot of people in this group fall is sort of what that community exercise could look like. So whether it's joining a local gym, a group exercise class, online training, or personal training even, can be great options. I've listed a couple here, but there's a location in, I think it's near Alpharetta, called Next Step Atlanta. Paralysis Recovery. Has anybody heard of them or worked with them? So that could be a good option. They have bikes and they have eStim, and they're not physical therapy professionals, but they are rehab trained professionals that can help you use all this equipment and continue your rehab once your insurance is no longer covering therapy services. It could be a good option. Shepherd has some programs, and then the YMCA is unique in that they've been working to include some adapted equipment into their repertoire. So it might be a good place to connect with or sign up for, so you can go into the community and lift weights and ride a bike and those kind of things. And I think Coach Maddox has come up in this group before as somebody members have used as a personal trainer. He does have neurospecific training. And I think that's something important to consider for everybody in this group, is that if you're going the personal training route, making sure the person you're working with really understands your needs and how to best maximize your learning. So this is my favorite slide. Everybody, if you've been tuning out, this is the time to look back in. Intensity is so often overlooked, and this really can be a make or break thing. It's sort of like if you're training for the 5K or the marathon and all you ever do is like walk and window shop, that's really not going to be enough to get you there. Like, that's not enough intensity to get you to your goals. And getting your heart rate up and getting that blood flowing is what makes that neuroplasticity stick. So when you're working out, it should feel like work. The scale on the right, we usually recommend everybody keep a copy with them. We talk a lot about it in therapy, that you should be working at least a 12. You should be in this orange zone, is what a moderate intensity exercise looks like. And as you're training, right, it should be getting harder. If you've been doing the same routine and walking at the same pace for 3 months, you're probably ready to move a little bit faster. So you're always trying to stick in this at least 12 or above. So just by training principles, you should always be lifting a little more weight, moving a little faster, going a little longer to keep yourself in that intensity range. Ideally, you should feel like you're working somewhat hard. It should be hard to do your exercise and hold a full conversation with somebody at the same time. Sort of like the talking test is what we like to call it. If you have a workout buddy, I can get about like a sentence out of like, oh man, like, how was your day? You're taking lots of breaths. You're working hard. And having a buddy or a trainer can help you do this and keep yourself safe and also push yourself appropriately. There's a couple different methods for training, and there's a couple slides down. There might be a good app that you like. We usually recommend mixing it up. So maybe one day you're doing sort of that a little lower intensity but a longer duration, but a couple times a week throwing in some of those higher intensity workouts where you're working hard for 30 seconds to a minute, and then you take a minute off and you work a little lower, but you're always working. We have a couple slides left here. So this one is just a nod to telehealth. Has anybody in this group done a telehealth visit with their clinician? Doctor, PT, anybody since this COVID thing started? I've done a couple. Has it been nice? Have you guys liked your experiences? It's definitely different. And especially as a therapist, it's real different to not have the patient next to you. But it's also convenient, right? There are some benefits to telehealth. And so if you guys are finding yourself in a position right now where you're listening to this and you're like, man, I really think I need to get back into my PT, or I have some questions for my doctor before I do this, this could be a good option for you. It lets you remain connected from the distance. We can easily progress the home exercise program over it. And it's been really great for people who have questions about things in their home. How do they interact in their home environment? They can sort of bring their camera around, which we don't get to do in an inpatient session. And then it also lets you guys sort of be in the driver's seat more than I think sometimes it can when people come into the clinic, right? You're taking control of your home exercise program through that. And hopefully this telehealth dialogue lets that come through a little bit more.
Yep.
Sort of pulling all that together, I want to hear from you guys. Like, where do you find yourself sort of on those options for intense rehab and intense recovery after your stroke? What do you do for exercise, and what do you find motivational that maybe you could use to encourage other people in this group? All right, well, we're sort of getting to the end here. So here's the last sort of couple slides, and we can skip all the ones on wearables because we just had a great conversation. But promoting continued rehab and getting to that intense level of exercise, one of the big things is resilience. So that's that ability to bounce back from a hard time or adversity. And there's lots of different character traits that fit in there. But the fact that you guys are here shows that you can do hard things, right? You've already done it. You've gotten this far. And if you still have goals and you still have things you want to get back to, it's going to take a little work. It's going to take more work than it felt like it took at the very beginning. But you are resilient. And I think another big point is to take ownership. It's your body and your health, and you know your body best. So as we've talked about from a lot of different situations, I think like be an advocate for yourself. Taking ownership over your exercise program or your desire to run a marathon or whatever that looks like next for you. Be curious, ask questions about wearables, ask questions about rehab timelines. You heard this random thing from a podcast. Call up your therapist and ask a question, look it up on the internet, do some of your own research. And then I think the biggest thing that can have the biggest difference is identifying your personal barriers. Right, there's things in all of our lives that make all the things you've talked about before this challenging. Getting to an intense level, getting to a 12 isn't easy. But what is it for you that makes it hard? And taking some time to not just be like, oh man, that's hard, but be like, why is it hard? Sit down, write out some things you think that are getting in the way of you getting to your goals. That's going to take more than just like a simple thought in your head. So set some time aside to be intentional about figuring out what's keeping you from getting to your goals. We only have a couple minutes, so I won't go a ton of time into this, but these are some things that had come up in previous conversations about barriers and things I've heard from my patients, from people saying why it's hard to stay engaged after they leave rehab. So maybe it's that lack of accountability or support. So you guys are here, you're in a support group, like take advantage of the people around you. Make an exercise group. Hey, we have Dana, we walk on Wednesdays. I don't know, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe it's something about your care partner, that it's been hard to communicate the needs to complete your home exercise program. So have an honest conversation, set a schedule, so it becomes something that's more in your control. Maybe it's not understanding what an exercise is or how you progress it. So call your PT up, get in touch with a personal trainer, find somebody who has that knowledge that can help you learn. Time is a huge one. I have this excuse all the time, and I don't do a lot about tearing down my barriers. But if it's a goal that you really have, schedule it into your day. Make it a priority. And then another common one is not having space or equipment. So look in the community. What can you do outside of your home that may increase your access to those things? This is the dip. anticipate the dip, right? We're saying do all these hard things, recovery can happen. But like we said, it can feel fast at the beginning and then it slows down. So after that first 6 months to a year, you've entered the dip. There's still somewhere you can go, but it's going to require a lot more effort. That hill's going to be bigger. But if you want to get there bad enough, put it in and you'll slowly get to the top. So know that it exists. But again, you guys are resilient. You've done hard things. This is not as hard as recovering from that stroke for the first year. So think about all the things you've already overcome. And then to the other points, track your progress. This is a great way to stay motivated. Focus on those incremental improvements. So number of steps a day, distance walked. You went from lifting a can of soup to an 8-pound gallon of milk. That's a big improvement. It's like 1% improvement every week ends up at 30% for the year or something close to that. So 37% is a lot. So don't discount those small steps towards a bigger goal. And then here's the nod to the wearables, which you've sort of already talked about. Some great wearables for tracking those basic health data. We've already mentioned the Apple Watch, the Fitbit, and the Garmin. Anna said she recommends the Fitbit. I use a Fitbit. I think it's been helpful. It syncs to your phone, but I think a lot of those do as well. And then phone applications, something like Map My Walk or Map My Run. So you can take it with you as you go out and it'll give you feedback on your pace and your distance. And then it's called SmartWAD, or you could use anything. It's called Tabata, T-A-B-A-T-A. It's like interval training. So this is just a recommended app that you can download on your phone to help you. It'll say like, go, and then it goes for 30 seconds and says take a break, and you can set those intervals. And like we talked about earlier, like if accountability is hard for you, connect your applications with a friend. So you say, hey, we're both going to get this many of steps a week. We're going to work out 5 days of the 7. And you can sort of see how each other are doing and keep each other accountable. So big picture, evidence support that the greatest functional improvement occurs in those first 6 months. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't mean after 6 months it stops. If you dedicate yourself to intense training, you're going to continue getting changes. I think the big takeaway is just finding a way that you enjoy staying active to help you maintain your general health and wellness and preventing backslides in your function. So I think we've all felt that a little bit in COVID. When we don't use it, we lose it. It's been how many months of varied access to a gym and varied ability to leave your house. So we're feeling that loss. So making sure you're figuring out a way to reintegrate this exercise into your life. And finding a neuro PT in your area is important. Just maintaining that relationship and having someone you can go to for checkups and questions, I think is really important. And so that's the end of my presentation. There's a couple of things at the end I can send out. There's some really good books that are written just, you don't need to have a degree in science or healthcare in order to understand these, but they talk about neuroplasticity and then habits and behavior change. I think that's the big overarching theme to a lot of these concepts that you guys might enjoy if you're into reading. And then I threw a few helpful links in there. But that is all I had to present. I had one more question that sort of goes back to that advocacy thing that Roger was bringing up. That like, so we have all these concepts and things we want. How do you guys overcome these barriers you're finding in the community, and maybe ways that as a group you could advocate for gyms to have better accessibility and better options for people who are trying to continue their recovery outside of their home. So hopefully this motivated you a little bit to get outside and walk some hills or climb some stairs or whatever that looks like